The wind whistled across the empty prairie, carrying with it the faint echo of spurs and the tired shuffle of a lone horse. The sky was painted in fading streaks of gold and crimson, the kind that made a man stop and remember what he'd lost. He rode with his hat pulled low, his eyes shaded against the dying sun, and his thoughts buried deep beneath the dust of years gone by. Folks in town called him the Quiet One. No one knew much about him except that he worked hard, kept to himself, and never stayed long enough to plant roots. He was the kind of cowboy who carried silence the way others carried a gun. Heavy, familiar, and always close. Every evening, he came to the same saloon at the edge of Dry Creek, ordered one drink, sat near the window and watched life move on without him. The piano in the corner played soft tunes of heartbreak and longing, and sometimes the laughter of couples made him flinch like an old wound reopening. He wasn't bitter, just alone. A man who had long accepted that loneliness was the only companion that never left. The folks in town assumed he was unmarried, and he never corrected them. It was easier that way, but that night something felt different. The air outside carried the smell of rain mixed with wood smoke. The saloon doors creaked open, letting in a gust of wind and a whisper of something strange. Change, maybe, or fate walking in on worn boots. The chatter paused for a moment as every head turned toward the door. A woman stepped inside. Her long dark coat was damp from the storm, her boots caked in mud, but her eyes held a steady fire that didn't waver, even when a dozen strangers stared her down. She looked around the room once, scanning every face until her gaze landed on him. He felt her stare before he saw it. There was something familiar in the way she stood, confident, unshaken, as if she had known this place long before setting foot in it. When her eyes met his, the glass in his hand stopped halfway to his lips. She walked straight toward him, her footsteps sharp against the wooden floor. The room fell quiet again, save for the soft crackle of the fireplace. He set his drink down slowly, unsure whether to stand or run. When she finally stopped before him, she said just one thing, clear enough for everyone to hear. "I'm your wife." The word struck him harder than a bullet. The saloon went dead silent. Someone dropped a glass behind the counter, and even the piano player froze mid-note. The cowboy blinked, thinking he'd misheard. A wife, his wife? He'd lived a life too simple, too empty to believe in something as heavy as that. He shook his head, his jaw tightening. "Ma'am, you've got the wrong man," he muttered, his voice low and rough from years of dust and silence. But she didn't back down. "No," she said, her voice steady. "I know your face. I know the scar on your hand and the way you twist your hat when you're nervous. You may have forgotten me, but I haven't forgotten you." Every man in that saloon leaned forward, waiting for his answer. The bartender stopped wiping the counter. Outside, thunder rolled across the plains, shaking the windows like the heavens themselves were listening. He stood slowly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Lady," he said quietly, "I don't know what kind of trouble you're bringing, but I don't have a wife." She looked at him for a long moment, then reached into her coat and pulled out a small, weathered piece of paper. It was torn and faded, but when she placed it on the table, the sight of it made his chest tighten. It was a marriage license dated years ago, with his name written clear as day beside hers. A wave of murmurs spread through the room. The cowboy felt the weight of every eye on him. His hands trembled slightly as he stared at the paper. He didn't remember signing anything. He didn't remember her, yet something deep inside, something buried under loneliness and regret, stirred like a ghost waking up. The woman's eyes softened, but her voice carried that same quiet strength. "You left before the ink was dry," she said. "They told me you were dead, but I waited. I searched every town west of the river, and here you are, drinking alone like nothing ever happened." He took a step back, confusion swirling with disbelief. "I've been on the trail near 6 years," he said. "Never had a home, never had a wife. I don't even remember where I came from before the war." His words came out rough, like gravel caught in his throat. Her expression flickered, part anger, part sorrow. "Then maybe you lost more than your memory," she whispered. He turned away, his hand gripping the edge of the table. The piano started up again softly, as if to fill the silence left hanging between them. Outside, rain began to fall hard against the windows, and the flickering lantern light danced across her face. Something about her, her voice, her courage, her calm in the storm, pulled at a part of him he didn't know was still alive. "Who are you?" he finally asked. She hesitated before answering. "The woman you swore to protect," she said quietly. "The one you said you'd come back for." A flash of memory cut through the haze. Gunfire in the distance, smoke rising from a burning barn, a woman's cry echoing through the night. He pressed his fingers to his temples, trying to pull the image into focus, but it slipped away like sand through his hands. He looked back at her, his breath uneven. "If what you're saying is true," he said slowly, "then tell me, why now? Why after all these years?" "Because," she said, her eyes glistening in the firelight, "what you don't remember could get you killed." The words hit him harder than the first. The saloon door swung open again as lightning lit the street outside, and a shadowed figure stood there, watching. The woman's gaze shifted toward the door, and for the first time since she'd walked in, fear crossed her face. He noticed it instantly. His hand instinctively went to the revolver at his side. "Who's that?" he asked, her voice dropped to a whisper. "The man who's been following me," she said. "And he's the reason I had to find you before he did." The cowboy felt a cold chill crawl up his spine. The stranger's silhouette lingered in the doorway for a heartbeat longer, then vanished into the rain. The woman looked back at him, her voice trembling just enough to betray the fear she was hiding. "You don't remember what you promised," she said. "But they do, and they're coming for both of us." The fire crackled, the piano went silent again, and the storm outside grew louder. The cowboy stood frozen between disbelief and instinct, torn between the life he thought he knew and the past that had just come crashing through the saloon doors. Somewhere deep down, something told him this woman wasn't lying, and that whatever truth she carried would change everything. He took a slow breath, his hand still hovering near his gun, and said in a low voice, "Then I reckon you better start talking." "Ma'am." But before she could answer, another flash of lightning lit the street, and the glint of a rifle barrel appeared just outside the window. The cowboy's eyes widened, the woman gasped, and the next moment was swallowed by thunder as the first shot rang out across Dry Creek. The glass shattered beside the cowboy's shoulder as the shot tore through the window. Instinct took over before thought could catch up. He grabbed the woman by the arm and pulled her down behind an overturned table. The saloon erupted into chaos, men ducking for cover, chairs splintering, and the bartender diving for the back door. The storm outside raged harder, wind howling through the broken window as rain poured in. The cowboy's heart hammered in his chest, but his hands were steady. He peeked over the table's edge and caught a glimpse of movement in the dark, a figure running between the wagons outside. He fired a single warning shot, but whoever it was disappeared into the storm. For a moment, only the rain and the crackle of the fireplace filled the silence. He turned back to the woman, her coat now soaked and her breathing uneven. "You hurt?" he asked. She shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. "No, but he won't stop. He'll follow us until you remember who you are." The words struck something deep again, that same unsettling feeling from before. He holstered his gun slowly, watching her closely. "You keep saying I knew you," he said. "That we were married. You got a paper, fine. But I got nothing in my head that makes that true. So why don't you start from the beginning and tell me what this is all about?" Her eyes softened, but she stayed quiet for a long while. The firelight flickered across her face, catching the sadness in her expression. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of years. "You were a soldier," she began. "You rode with the territorial cavalry during the border wars. You were shot outside Fort Mason and left for dead. I found you there. You had no memory, no name. You said the only thing you remembered was the sound of thunder and a woman's cry." He frowned, his fingers brushing against the scar along his ribs, a wound he'd never been able to explain. "Go on," he said. "I nursed you back," she continued, her eyes distant as if seeing ghosts. "We lived in a cabin by the river for almost a year. You built it yourself with wood you cut from the pines. You said you didn't care who you used to be. You just wanted peace. We married there under the spring sky, with no preacher, no witnesses but God and the wind. You made me promise never to tell anyone your real name, not even when the soldiers came asking." He stared at her, feeling the fire's warmth but none of its comfort. "If all that's true," he said slowly, "then why'd I leave?" Her lips trembled. "Because they found us, the same men who tried to kill you. They burned the cabin and took everything we had. You told me to run while you drew them away. I never saw you again. I thought you were gone." He tried to process her words, but his mind felt split between truth and smoke. Images came in flashes, firelight on wet wood, the smell of pine, a woman's voice calling his name through the dark. But the more he tried to grab onto the memory, the faster it slipped away. "You're telling me I was hunted," he said. "For what reason?" She looked toward the window where the rain still beat down. You knew something, she said quietly. Something men were willing to kill to bury. He leaned back in his chair, the creak of the wood cutting through the silence. Lady, I don't know what kind of trouble you're dragging behind you, but I ain't the man you think I am. Her eyes flashed with anger. Then why did you save me just now? He had no answer for that. Something in him, something deeper than memory, had moved on instinct. He sighed and rubbed a hand across his face. You should stay out of sight till morning. Whoever's after you'll be back. The bartender peeked from behind the counter. You two best clear out, he muttered. Sheriff's on his way, and I ain't wanting my place turned into a battleground. The cowboy tossed a few coins on the counter and motioned for the woman to follow. They slipped out the back door into the rain-soaked alley, keeping low as thunder rolled above. The horses were tied nearby, restless from the noise. He untied his and motioned her to climb up behind him. She hesitated only a moment before obeying. As he kicked the horse into motion, the saloon lights faded behind them, swallowed by the storm. They rode hard until the glow of town disappeared, and the only sounds were rain and hoofbeats on wet earth. The prairie stretched endless before them, silvered by lightning flashes. When they finally stopped near a ridge overlooking a dried-up riverbed, he helped her down and tied the horse beneath a mesquite tree. The rain had eased, but the night was cold. He started a small fire with flint and dry bark from his saddlebag. She sat close, shivering, her eyes fixed on the flames. For a long while, neither spoke. Finally, he said, If what you said's true, that means I've been living a lie near 6 years. I'd like to know who these men are and why they'd want me dead. She looked at him across the fire, her face half-shadowed. They're soldiers turned mercenaries. You led a unit that uncovered something during the border conflict. A ledger, a list of names tied to land theft and murder. Men in power. They tried to destroy it, and when you wouldn't hand it over, they came after you. He frowned, the name Fort Mason ringing again in his head like a half-forgotten dream. And you say I took that ledger? You hit it, she said. But before you could tell me where, they came. I thought it was gone forever, until word reached me that someone was asking questions again. Someone who knew your name. He leaned back, letting her words sink in. A chill crawled through him that had nothing to do with the rain. So that man in the saloon. He's one of them. Yes, she said. And there'll be more. The fire crackled softly as wind swept through the canyon below. The cowboy stared into the flames, his reflection dancing in the glow. He felt the pull of two worlds, the empty, quiet one he'd built for himself, and the violent past she claimed was his. You still don't believe me, she said softly. He looked up at her, his eyes tired but steady. I want to, he said. But belief and memory ain't the same thing. Right now all I got's your word, and a paper that says I'm a husband I can't recall being. She reached into her coat again and drew out a small silver locket. When she opened it, he saw a faded sketch inside, a younger version of him with his arm around her shoulders. His breath caught as he stared at it. The face was his, but softer, unscarred by time and loss. The handwriting beneath it read, Forever yours. For the first time, doubt gave way to something else. Recognition. Faint, but real. He closed his hand over the locket and looked away. If this is true, he said, then maybe I've been running from my own past all this time. The woman nodded, tears shining in her eyes. You didn't run, she whispered. You fought. You just never made it home. He didn't know what to say after that. The fire burned low and the prairie seemed to hold its breath. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote cried into the night. Suddenly, the horse snorted and stamped nervously. The cowboy rose to his feet, hand instinctively going to his revolver. The woman tensed. What is it? She asked. Someone's out there, he said. He stepped away from the firelight, his boots sinking softly into the wet ground. The night was pitch black now, and the only light came from the faint glow of the fire behind him. He listened. At first there was nothing, just the wind sighing through the grass. Then he heard it, the soft creak of a saddle and the jingle of metal. He turned sharply toward the sound, gun raised. A voice called out from the dark. You can't hide forever, soldier. The woman gasped and backed toward the fire. The cowboy stood still, the name cutting deep. Soldier. Whoever was out there knew him. Lightning flashed again, and in that brief burst of light, he saw the outline of 3 riders on the ridge. They weren't lawmen. He could tell by the way they moved. Slow, deliberate, like hunters closing in on prey. He lowered his gun slightly and looked back at her. We move at first light, he said quietly. Till then, stay close and keep that fire low. She nodded, fear flickering behind her composure. The rain began again, soft and steady, as the riders' silhouettes melted back into the dark. The cowboy sat beside her, the flames reflecting in his weary eyes. For the first time in years, he wasn't just a drifter chasing silence. He was a man being chased by a truth he no longer remembered, and by enemies who clearly hadn't forgotten him. As the storm rolled across the plains, he looked toward the horizon, where dawn would soon rise. Somewhere out there lay the answers he didn't want to face, and a past waiting to catch up with him. Dawn crept in pale and cold, washing the prairie with a thin silver that made every mesquite branch look like wire. The cowboy did not sleep. He sat with his back to a boulder, hat brim low, watching the ridge where the three riders had appeared. The woman rested near the dying coals, her coat pulled tight, the locket held in both hands as if it were a warm stone. When the first meadowlark broke the night, he stirred the ashes with a stick and covered the fire. They saddled in silence. They rode with the riverbed on their left and a broken fence line to the right, the kind of fence that told of a ranch once alive and now gone quiet. The cowboy looked over the emptiness and felt a pull he could not explain. Pieces of a life sat in that empty space, axe marks on a stump, a rope swing without a seat. He wanted to turn away from it and could not. By mid-morning, the clouds had lifted and the sun pressed hard, drying the leather in his hands. The woman finally spoke. She pointed to a rise of cottonwoods and a low roof peeking through. A stage stop. There would be water, biscuits, and questions. He nodded and kept his eyes sweeping the edges of the road. The keeper at the station was the talkative kind. He set a tin mug of coffee in front of the cowboy and gave the woman a shawl he said used to be his sister's. The cowboy barely touched the mug. He stood near the door and watched a rider lead 3 mules across the far flats, a dust ribbon trailing him. "You come out of Dry Creek last night," the keeper said in a low voice. "Heard shots carried on the storm. Sheriff took a posse and rode east. Folks say trouble's been stirring since that new rail agent started buying up parcels. Funny how papers change hands when men vanish." The woman glanced at the cowboy, then back at the keeper. "You hear any talk of Fort Mason men?" The keeper scratched his jaw. "Some riders came through 2 days back, wore army coats without the pride that goes with them, spent more time watching the door than drinking. One of them asked after a man with a scar on his hand and a way of sitting like he expects a wall to fall." His eyes dropped to the cowboy's hand. "No offense meant. None taken," the cowboy said. "Which way did they head?" "South Rim, toward the old mission." The woman's gaze sharpened. "The mission by the dry wells." The cowboy felt the word hook something inside him. Mission. Dry wells. His head throbbed in a slow, dull push. He paid for the coffee and asked for a sack of hardtack and salt. The keeper passed it over and leaned close. "If you stir the nest, stir it quick," he said. "This country holds on to secrets the way river mud holds a boot." They left the station by a back trail that ran behind the cottonwoods. The land fell into gullies and lifted into knuckled hills, each turn showing another place to lie in wait. The cowboy moved with a calm the woman had seen once before, when they fled fire and gun smoke by the river. He did not look like a lost man then. He looked like a man who knew the ground and the way danger breathed. By noon, the sun burned white and the horses sweated dark at the shoulders. They halted in a wash and watered the animals from a shallow pool. The woman unfolded the marriage paper and the locket, studying both as if something new might rise from the old marks. "You hid the ledger where no one would look," she said, half to herself. "You said it needed a place that would not burn and would not tempt thieves. You said a church can hold a sin without knowing it." "Mission," he said, as if the word had been waiting behind his teeth. He looked toward the south rim. "Stone walls thick, a bell tower, and dry wells," she added. "You said a man can hear his own voice come back out of a dry well like a warning." A hawk circled overhead. The cowboy rewrapped the paper and handed it to her. "If the ledger sits there, so will the men who want it. Then we find proof," she said. "Proof for a judge. Proof for a newspaper. Names on land deeds. Names on army payrolls. Names that match graves with no markers. We do not need all of it today. We only need to show the first stone. First we stay alive," he said. They rode again, keeping the sun over the right shoulder, cutting a line that would touch the mission from behind. The land turned rough and stony. Sage brushed their legs and gave off a bitter scent. A set of old wagon ruts ran beside them and then vanished into scrub. Near the rim they found tracks. 3 horses. Fresh. The riders had looped wide, then cut back toward the mission on a narrow shelf road. The cowboy crouched and touched the print. One shoe showed a loose nail. He looked up at the woman. Same men, he said. How can you tell? Loose iron sings on rock, he said. You can hear it if the wind is right. He paused. I used to teach that. She watched his face when he said it and saw the flicker of a past trying to find its way through. Before she could answer, a thin whistle carried from the ridge, the kind a quail gives before it runs. The cowboy's head came up. He moved to the edge and peered over. Far below, a single rider waited in the shade of a mesquite, hat down, horse breathing slow. A scout. The cowboy motioned her back and they slid into the shadow of a split boulder. He studied the lines of the ground, the way a hunter studies wind and hollow. He spoke low. They will have one at the mission, one here, and one circling to pinch. They do not know if we are 2 or 6. They want to see us move. Then we do not move, she said. He looked at the sky. We move when the light goes soft. Till then, we make another trail for them to follow. He led the horses into the wash and wrapped their hooves with strips torn from a blanket. He dragged a mesquite limb behind them to smear sign, and set a small decoy fire in a pocket where smoke would drift. He left a coffee tin on a rock where a spyglass would catch it. Then he took the woman and climbed to a narrow ledge that looked back on their own false camp. They waited. Hours lengthened like hot wire. The woman's breathing slowed to the patient rhythm of someone who had learned to hold quiet for long stretches. The cowboy used the time the way a wheelwright uses daylight. He rebuilt pieces in his mind. The border wars. A unit that had turned away from orders. A set of names in a ledger that could turn a wide country angry. He saw again a room of stone, a rough altar, and his own hands lifting a floor plank that groaned the way old wood groans when it wants to keep a secret. Late sun finally spilled copper on the rim. A horse moved below them, then another. The scout made a sign and the third rider appeared near the decoy smoke. The cowboy tracked them with his eyes. He could feel their timing. He could hear in his head the order the leader would give. Hold the high. Send one to the mouth of the wash. Wait for the rabbits to bolt, only no one bolted. The woman kept her gaze steady on the mission tower that showed itself now against the sky, a dark tooth on the ridge. When the 3 finally pushed toward the false camp and found nothing but a warm tin and a curl of ash, they cursed, turned in a broken circle, and then split. One rode for the tower. The loose shoe pinged on stone. The cowboy breathed out. He had his music now. Time, he whispered. They climbed in a long slant that kept breaks of rock between them and the riders. The mission showed its bones as they neared. Sun-baked stone, a bell hanging without a tongue, a doorway that had lost its door. The wells sat like open mouths without water, ringed by weeds and fallen bricks. The air smelled of dust and bats. Inside, the chapel held a hush that made even the wind respectful. The woman took off her hat and traced the sign of the cross without thinking. The cowboy moved to the front and pressed his palm to the floor, where he had seen it in his mind. His hand shook once and then steadied. He slid his knife into the seam of the board and worked it like a man who had done exactly that before. The plank lifted a finger's width. Bootsteps scraped in the side passage. The cowboy froze and eased the board back into place. He raised 2 fingers to the woman, then pointed to the shadow behind the altar. She moved without a sound. He stepped into the line of the doorway and met the first rider with calm eyes and empty hands. Lost? The cowboy asked. The rider's gun stayed low but ready. He had the look of a man who follows orders and likes them simple. Ledger, he said. Hand it over. No ledger here, the cowboy said. Only stone and Sunday dust. Funny, the rider said. Because you picked this place when you ran. You always liked stone. Stone does not burn. The woman watched from the shadow, reading the angle of his shoulders. She saw the moment he recognized the cowboy, not just the scar, the way he did not look away. The rider's mouth tightened. You should have stayed dead, the rider said. The cowboy smiled without warmth. Men keep telling me that. It never takes, Steele flashed. The rider chose the quick route. The cowboy moved faster. He struck the gun aside and drove a shoulder into the man's chest. The shot cracked and went into the wall, showering dust. The cowboy twisted the pistol free and tossed it into the side passage. The rider scrambled and grabbed a knife, but the woman stepped out with the locket in one hand and a stone in the other. She slammed the stone into the rider's wrist. The knife clattered. Tell your leader we're not rabbits, she said, eyes steady. The rider reeled, stared at her as if seeing a ghost, then ran for the door with his pride bleeding. The cowboy let him go. Noise would draw the others away from the chapel mouth. They waited until the echoes faded. The cowboy lifted the plank again, breath tight. Beneath lay a bundle wrapped in oilcloth the color of old saddle. His finger stopped an inch from it. You do not want to know, he said. If you do, you cannot unknow it. She reached past him and touched the oilcloth. "I knew when they burned our home," she said. "I knew when I crossed 2 territories with nothing but this locket. I knew last night when a bullet came through a saloon window." "Open it," he untied the cord. Inside lay a ledger bound in cracked leather, with pages crowded by neat ink and neat lies. There were ranch brands paired with army requisitions, parcel numbers beside initials that matched officials. There were entries that placed the taking of land on the same day as the making of law. There was a list on the back page with a single word above it. "Witnesses." The woman's mouth went dry. She pointed to a line. "That is the judge in Dry Creek." The cowboy scanned lower and found a name he did not want to see because it explained too much silence. "The sheriff." He closed the book and wrapped it again. "We have to get this to someone who is not bought," she said. He shook his head. "First we keep it from being taken. Then we choose a road that does not run straight into a gallows someone has set for us." Voices swelled in the courtyard. The scout had found the thrown pistol. The others would count the footprints and measure the time. The cowboy slid the ledger under his coat and scanned the walls. He led her to the sacristy, where a narrow slit opened to the outer walk. If they went single file, heads low, they could reach the back of the bell tower and drop to the far slope. It was tight and dark. Bats turned in the high spaces with the sound of paper rubbing paper. Halfway through the slit, the woman stopped and looked back into the chapel. She stared at the altar stone, at the place where vows could still hang in the air even when no one spoke. Her voice was quiet. "When we stood by the river, you said if the world forgot us, we would still hold the truth between us," she whispered. "Do you remember even a piece of that?" He held her gaze a long second. Something tender and hard moved across his face. "I remember the way your voice made a hard day less hard," he said. "I remember that a promise is lighter to carry than regret." Outside, a rifle bolt rang. The spell broke. They slid along the cold stone and dropped to the slope of broken tiles and weeds. The sun had fallen behind the ridge. Shade climbed fast. The cowboy cut across a goat path and led her into a cleft that opened to a narrow draw. He counted the steps like a prayer he once knew by heart. At 10, the ground gave. The woman went to one knee. He hauled her up and they reached a line of scrub where their horses waited, hidden. They swung up and turned west, keeping the tower behind a shoulder of rock. The first shout rose at their back. A second answered from near the wells. The cowboy put his heels to the horse and the animal leapt as if it understood the stakes. The woman clung to the saddle horn with one hand and to the oilcloth package tucked under his coat with the other. They cut into a wash choked with willow. Hoofbeats thundered from the slope above. A dark shape flashed across the rim, then another. The loose shoe sang. The cowboy counted again. One above, one flanking, one dropping to the mouth. He lifted the horse over a fallen log and felt the whole wash bend toward a choke point he had not seen from the map in his head. "Trap," he said. The woman nodded once, jaw set. "Then we break it." A narrow side cut open to the right, little more than a scar in the bank. The cowboy took it because there was nothing else to take. It rose steep, then turned blind. He felt the horse falter and drove it on. Above them, a shadow detached from a cedar and dropped into their path. A man with a carbine leveled across his forearm stepped forward, calm as a clerk behind a desk. He smiled without warmth. "End of the line," the man said. "You carry something that belongs to others." The cowboy drew in a slow breath and looked back down the cut. Dust lifted where the other two riders closed in. He looked forward at the calm man with the carbine, and then at the woman. Her eyes were steady. The ledger pressed like a heartbeat against his ribs. The wind carried the smell of rain far off, and the faint iron song of a loose nail on rock. He settled his hat and eased his hand toward the reins, measuring angles and distances the way a carpenter measures a plank. Behind them, a hawk cried. Above them, a cloud slipped over the sun and threw the cut into deep shade. The man with the carbine shifted his feet for a better hold. The cowboy's horse gathered itself. The woman set her shoulders. No one moved for the space of a long breath as the old mission bell tower stood silent on the ridge, and the wide frontier held its breath with it. The air hung thick between them. The man with the carbine stood in the narrow cut, his boots planted firm in the dust, and the cowboy could see that small smile that never reached his eyes, the kind of smile that belonged to men who'd done too much killing to flinch anymore. The woman sat rigid behind the cowboy, her hand gripping the back of his coat, the hidden ledger pressing against his ribs like a live thing. Somewhere above, a hawk circled once and vanished into the gray. The cowboy kept his voice even. "You don't want to pull that trigger," he said quietly. The man tilted his head. "You still think you get to give orders?" You're just a name on a page that should have stayed crossed out. The men you tried to expose made sure of that. Then why chase me? The cowboy asked. If they already buried the truth? The man's grin widened. Because you took the one copy they couldn't burn. The ledger. The proof. And now you're going to hand it over like a good soldier. Behind them, hoofbeats thundered down the slope. The cowboy knew the other two riders were closing in. Dust clouds rose in the narrow space, the horses breathing hard and restless. There wasn't time to talk, but there wasn't any room to run either. He leaned slightly forward and whispered without turning his head. Hold tight. Before she could answer, he drove his heels into the horse's flanks. The animal lunged forward and the first shot cracked. The sound bounced off the walls of the cut, deafening and close. The bullet grazed the horse's shoulder, and the beast reared, screaming, throwing its weight into the charge. The cowboy ducked low, the woman clinging to him as they slammed into the carbine man before he could fire again. Both men and horse tumbled into a cloud of dust. The cowboy hit the ground hard, rolled, and came up with his revolver drawn. The man with the carbine scrambled to his feet, his mouth bleeding from the fall. They locked eyes. The cowboy fired once, hitting the carbine out of his hand. The man yelled and dove behind a rock, shouting something to the others. The cowboy grabbed the woman's hand and pulled her toward a break in the rock wall. Move, he barked. They stumbled through the narrow gap, sliding down a slope of gravel that tore their palms raw. When they reached the bottom, they were in a dry ravine, shallow but long enough to run unseen for a while. Gunfire echoed behind them. A bullet struck a rock near her boot, sparking bright against the stone. She gasped but kept moving, her breath ragged. The cowboy glanced back. One of the riders was already descending the slope on horseback, rifle leveled. He fired a few covering shots over his shoulder, driving the pursuer back just long enough to reach the end of the ravine. At the edge, the ground dropped into a narrow canyon with a stream far below. The only way down was steep and slick. We'll break our necks, she said between breaths. Better than letting them take us alive, he replied. Without another word, he looped his arm around her waist and leapt. The world spun in a blur of rocks and cold air. They hit the slope and slid, half falling, half riding the gravel until they landed in the shallow stream below. The water bit like ice. They scrambled behind a boulder just as a bullet splashed into the water beside them. The cowboy steadied his breath and checked his revolver. 2 bullets left. He looked at the woman. You hurt? She shook her head. No, but they'll come down after us. Then we keep moving. They followed the stream, crouched low, water soaking their boots and legs. The canyon walls pressed close on both sides, the sun barely cutting through. The sound of their pursuers grew fainter, replaced by the whisper of water and the heavy thud of their own hearts. After what felt like an hour, they reached a bend where the canyon widened into an open valley. A few dead trees leaned over a ruined cabin that looked like it had been standing since before either of them was born. Smoke stains marked the stones near what was once a chimney. This place, the woman whispered. I've seen it before. He looked around. How? Her voice trembled. When they came after us the first time, before the fire. This was where we hid for one night. You said it was an old scout's outpost. Said no one would find us here. The cowboy's eyes searched the cabin, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. He stepped inside, brushing away cobwebs. The air smelled of dust, ash, and forgotten years. In one corner lay a rusted lantern and a broken rifle. He knelt and touched the dirt floor. There was a faint mark there, an old boot print pressed deep, nearly faded. His boot fit perfectly over it. Something inside him cracked open. A flash came to him. Moonlight pouring through this same broken roof, her hand trembling in his as fire glowed in the distance. Her voice saying, "Don't let go." His own voice answering, "I'll come back." Then the sound of gunfire and the smell of smoke. He jerked back to the present, his chest heaving. The woman stood near the door watching him. "You remember," she whispered. He didn't answer. He just looked at her for a long time, the shadow of that past flickering behind his eyes. Before either could speak again, a horse whinnied outside. The sound was close, too close. The cowboy's instinct snapped back into place. He motioned for her to stay quiet and moved to the shattered window. Through the gaps in the wall, he saw one of the riders dismounting, leading his horse carefully, scanning the area with his rifle ready. The man with the loose shoe. The cowboy turned back to her and mouthed, "Stay here." He slipped out the back through a hole in the wall and circled the cabin. The rider stopped near the front door, unaware he was being watched. When the cowboy stepped out of the shadows, the man spun, but too late. They collided, the rifle knocking free. They wrestled in the mud, fists slamming. boots digging into the wet ground. The rider was strong, but the cowboy fought like a man who'd been fighting his whole life to stay alive. The woman appeared in the doorway, panic flashing in her eyes. She looked around for a weapon and grabbed the rusted rifle, swinging it like a club. She struck the rider across the back and he fell forward with a cry. The cowboy pinned him down, breath heavy. "How many of you are there?" he demanded. The man spat blood and sneered. "Enough." The cowboy's hand tightened on his collar. "Who's paying you?" The man's grin widened through broken teeth. "The same folks you used to ride with. You think you can bring them down with a book? They'll burn the whole territory first." The cowboy's jaw clenched. Maybe this time they picked the wrong man to chase. He hit the man once more, hard enough to knock him out, then dragged his limp body into the cabin. The woman looked at him with a mix of fear and relief. "He said they'll burn the territory," she whispered. "That means there's more coming." "I know," he said. "We can't keep running. We have to find a way to turn the hunt," she frowned. "How?" He picked up the fallen rifle and checked its chamber. "By taking the fight to them." The words came out quiet but solid. The woman's eyes widened slightly. "You mean go after them? You don't even know how many there are." "I don't have to," he said. "I just need one alive, the one who gives orders." They spent the rest of the afternoon preparing. He found old supplies in the cabin, half a coil of rope, an empty canteen, a handful of cartridges still good enough to use. As the sun began to sink, they packed the horse and buried the unconscious man beneath a pile of broken boards to buy themselves time. By dusk, the valley was nothing but a sea of long shadows. The cowboy led the horse by hand, moving with the caution of someone who knew every sound carried on still air. The woman followed close, her eyes sharp, her hand always near the locket. The silence between them was heavy, filled with things neither dared to say. As the sky darkened, they reached the edge of a plateau overlooking the plains. Far in the distance, fires burned, a camp. The cowboy could make out faint silhouettes of men moving around wagons and tethered horses. The mercenaries' camp. The smell of wood smoke drifted faintly through the wind. The woman's breath caught. "That's them," he nodded. "They'll have a leader, maybe a messenger riding between the towns. If we can take him, we'll know who's behind this." She looked at him with quiet fear. "You're going down there?" He met her eyes. "You wanted to end this. This is how." She wanted to argue but knew he was right. The truth they carried wasn't just about land or names. It was about every life that had been taken to keep that ledger buried. He turned toward her. "Stay back here till I give a sign. If I don't come out before sunrise, you ride west to the rail line. Show that book to the first lawman you can trust." Her hand caught his sleeve. "You said you'd come back once before." He looked down at her, the faintest ache crossing his face. "Then maybe it's time I keep that promise." Before she could speak again, he slipped into the dark, vanishing among the rocks. The sound of his footsteps faded with the wind. She stood there, clutching the locket and praying the night wouldn't swallow him whole. Below, the campfire burned steady. Men laughed, rifles glinted, and somewhere among them was the man who held every answer and every danger. The cowboy moved like a shadow between the wagons, counting faces, measuring distances, the firelight flickering across the scars on his hands. The hunt had turned. The past was closing in, and the final reckoning was no longer a matter of running. It was waiting for him, somewhere in that camp, under the same sky that had once seen him promise a woman forever. And as the night deepened over the plains, the sound of a distant coyote broke the silence, carrying through the dark like an omen that something was coming, something neither of them could escape. The night was heavy with smoke and fear. Down in the valley, the mercenaries' camp glowed like a nest of embers under the black sky. The cowboy moved silently among the rocks, each step careful, each breath steady. He could hear voices below, men laughing, the clatter of tin cups, the low rumble of a man giving orders. His eyes fixed on the biggest tent at the center. That was where the decisions were made. That was where the truth lived. He eased his revolver free and crept closer. A guard passed within a few feet, humming a tune and dragging his boots through the dirt. The cowboy waited, patient as a snake in the grass, until the man turned his back. Then he moved. In a few swift steps, he slipped behind the supply wagon and crouched near the tent flap. Inside, the voices were clearer now. One was calm and smooth, the kind of voice that didn't belong to a hired gun, the kind that belonged to someone used to being obeyed. "Tomorrow we ride to town," the voice said. "We'll take the judge's copy before it reaches the rail. Once the ledger's gone, there'll be no proof left. And make sure the woman's found." "She knows too much." The cowboy's jaw tightened. That voice, he knew it. The tone, the rhythm. A flood of memory hit him. A man in uniform giving orders at Fort Mason. A man who had smiled when innocent families were pushed from their land. Colonel Redden, the same man who had ordered his death years ago. The cowboy pushed open the tent flap and stepped inside. The firelight flickered on his face. The colonel froze mid-sentence, his glass halfway to his lips. "Well," he said slowly, lowering it. "The ghost rides again." The men in the tent reached for their guns, but the cowboy's revolver was already up. "Drop 'em," he said. His voice was calm, but the edge in it could cut through iron. The mercenaries hesitated, glancing at the colonel, then one by one lowered their weapons. Redden's smile returned, thin and cold. "You think this ends with a gun, boy? You can kill me, sure, but that ledger won't change anything. Men like me built this territory. You'll hang for treason before anyone calls you a hero." The cowboy's eyes didn't move. "You built it on graves. You took land that wasn't yours and called it law," Redden chuckled. "Law is written by the men who survive." "That's where you're wrong," the cowboy said quietly. "It's written by the men who can still look themselves in the mirror after the dust settles." Before the colonel could reply, a shot cracked from outside. The tent burst into chaos. Someone yelled, "Riders coming from the ridge!" The woman had come. She had waited till dawn and, seeing no sign, had ridden down to find him. The mercenaries scrambled for their guns, confusion breaking their lines. The cowboy ducked behind the table and fired twice. 2 men went down before they even knew where the shots came from. Redden lunged for the ledger on the table, but the cowboy moved first, kicking it away and slamming the colonel against the tent pole. The older man fought hard, fueled by fury, but the years had softened him. They crashed through the back of the tent, rolling in the dirt. The colonel drew a knife and swung wildly. The blade cut across the cowboy's sleeve, grazing skin, but the cowboy caught his wrist and twisted. The knife fell. In the distance, horses screamed and rifles roared. The woman's silhouette flashed against the firelight as she fired from the saddle, driving back the riders. Her face was fierce with determination, the same look she'd worn the night they fled the burning cabin. The colonel tried to reach for the fallen gun, but the cowboy kicked it aside. "You had your chance to do right," he said. Redden spat dirt. "You don't get to judge me." "I ain't judging," the cowboy said. "I'm just finishing what you started." The struggle ended with a single shot. Silence followed, broken only by the crackle of flames and the pounding of hooves. The cowboy stood over the fallen colonel, his revolver still warm in his hand. He felt no triumph, only the weight of years settling in his bones. The woman ran to him, her hair wild in the wind. "Are you hurt?" He shook his head. "Not bad." "Then let's go," she said, glancing toward the ridge. "They're breaking. We can make it before more come." He nodded and grabbed the ledger from where it had fallen. Together they ran for the horses. Behind them the camp burned, tents collapsing, the night alive with the roar of fire and the sound of a world built on lies falling apart. They rode hard through the plains until the sun rose behind them, turning the sky gold. The wind tore through their clothes and the open land stretched endless ahead. When they finally stopped at the old telegraph station near the rail line, both were covered in dust and silence. The station clerk looked up as they burst through the door. "You folks look like you've been chased by the devil." The cowboy placed the ledger on the counter. "Send a message to the governor in Austin," he said. "Tell him it's time the truth was seen. This book's got the proof of every stolen acre and every name tied to it." The clerk blinked, confused, but nodded. "You sure about this?" "Men will come after whoever sends it." The cowboy gave a small, tired smile. "They've already come. Let's make sure it counts for something." By midday, word spread through the town. Riders from the capital arrived days later with guards and a warrant. The ledger was taken under protection, its contents verified, its names read aloud in the courthouse. Ranchers, soldiers, and judges, all of them exposed. The town that once whispered the cowboy's name now spoke it with respect. He stood outside the courthouse as the wind stirred the dust, his hat low, the woman beside him. "It's over," she said softly. "Maybe for now," he replied. "But peace don't stay long in this kind of country. There'll always be someone trying to take what ain't theirs." She looked at him, a faint smile on her lips. "Then maybe we stay and help keep it honest." He met her eyes. "You sure that's what you want?" "I ain't the same man you married." She reached for his hand. "You're the only man I ever waited for." For the first time in years, he let himself breathe easy. The ache of loss, the weight of guilt, all of it began to fade under the warmth of that morning sun. The land around them was quiet again, burned, scarred, but free. Weeks passed. The town rebuilt what had been broken. The cowboy took work helping others mend fences and drive cattle for honest pay. The woman found her peace in small things, planting a garden, tending to the stray horse they'd rescued along the way. Some evenings they sat on the porch of the cabin they built together, watching the prairie turn gold under the sunset. He rarely spoke of the past anymore, but sometimes when the wind carried the faint ring of the old mission bell, he'd stop and look west. She'd notice always and slip her hand into his without a word. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It was home. Years later, travelers passing through Dry Creek would hear the story of the lonely cowboy who thought he had no family, until a woman rode in from the storm and called him husband. They'd say the two of them stood against men with power and greed, armed with nothing but courage and a ledger full of truth. Some called it legend, others called it luck. But those who'd met them knew it was love, the quiet kind that survives storms and wars and years of waiting. And when the wind rose across the plains at dusk, carrying the scent of rain and dust, it sometimes sounded like a whisper, soft, steady, and full of life again, the sound of a promise kept, long after the fighting was done. In the end, he wasn't just a drifter or a soldier or a name lost in old records. He was a man who'd found his way back from the edge of forgetting, who'd kept his word to the woman who believed in him when the rest of the world thought he was gone. The lonely cowboy was lonely no more, and somewhere in the fading light, the land itself seemed to sigh in relief, as if it too remembered him.